Today, I'd like to try something different because the subject's been on my mind. Because today, I'd just like to pose a question and some of my thoughts on it, and I want to be clear, I have no great solutions to this problem. But frankly, I'm surprised that it's not talked about more, which is, why is it that class isn't as much of a contentious subject as race in the USA? Hey, XenPuck here. Another day mostly just spent pondering on this rather curious world that we live in, right? So it's very apparent that racism is in the news these days, right? And whether I think how it's being talked about in the public sphere is mostly relevant. I mean, as much as the recent tensions against Asian Americans have been present, I'd argue, generally speaking, I personally have had it not too bad, right? Not to minimize the experience of any other individuals, but I can really only speak from my own personal set of experiences, right? It's not bad for me. Not saying that it can't or hasn't been bad for other Asian Americans, right? But due to the fact that it's not bad for me, it colors my perception of racism generally. That is to say, obviously I agree that it's a problem, and yet the cross-section between the urban and rural, the socially liberal and conservative, and more importantly, the rich and poor, seems to be almost entirely overshadowed by the talks of race, right? So I'm mostly curious as to why that is. When we talk about equality or inequality, why is it that in the US we never put class front and center? Again, I want to make it clear, I don't have any answers. I'm not saying I don't have good answers, okay? I'm pretty sure I don't have any answers. But we are in the internet-connected digital age these days, so maybe you guys can come up with an equitable solution to by the power of consensus, right, to this problem, or at least show me or tell me something that I didn't know before. I always do love to learn. Okay. So instead, today I want to just outline a few ways to think about class that I feel like would make it a different, if not better, indicator of inequality than race. Right. Number one, education. I think is generally where we agree that it affects the earning potential of future adults in the developed world, right? Or really anywhere outside of a war-torn country, right? And in the USA, public education is paid by, I believe, local area property taxes. So racially speaking, I totally get there are some very significant obstacles in terms of access to neighborhoods, and pricing by neighborhoods remain opaquely low on different and minority major neighborhoods, even up until this day, right? And that would surprise the quality of the public schools nearby. However, aren't there also just straight up poor neighborhoods or towns in states where there are not as much minorities at all? Like, I'm thinking of the areas other people might refer to as being populated by, rednecks, okay? Again, I don't use terms like this generally, only because I don't really understand where they come from, so it's not my place to qualify such usage, right? My point is, do I assume that somehow just because an area is filled with poor people of the majority race, that somehow these poor kids would get a better education than the poor kids in majority neighborhoods or towns? I would imagine the answer is no, right? Like, am I missing something? So then at the end of the day, while I agree that if you simply compare two poor kids, one black and one white, the minority kid probably has it worse if you total all the disadvantages, via social expectations, right? But I also don't think it's too much of a hard sell to imagine that neither of these kids could and would likely break out of the trap of their upbringing simply due to the type of mental institutional prison that's been weighing on them since birth, right? Number two, in this framework, as an adult, even now, right, I find the types of activities that I do, it's mostly related to the social class that I'm placing myself in, rather than my race, right? I mean, the caveat here is the word mostly, okay, not all. I'm just saying, okay, maybe, for example, the counterexample is I like some really bizarre food items that most Americans probably wouldn't want to try. And that's because of my cultural upbringing, right? Manifesting it in a particular type of considered culinary norm, right? That's different from the majority. But plenty of other things that both my wifey and I enjoy, such as relatively luxury travel, chasing trendy foods around town, and going to live music events, and so on. They're just bougie manifestations that's appropriate to where we are in life, right? Heck, my wife even started getting into golf like years ago, mostly as a way to advance her career as a consultant, right? My point is, when I pick people to do things with, I'm mainly picking them based on who else wants to do similar stuff, right? Go see similar bands in similar areas, right? Which race that person is completely doesn't even come up in my mind, right? Again, I get that there are some systemic factors that, for instance, would preclude some groups from being interested in certain types of activities, or more importantly, certain geographic proximities, right? Again, to me and any of the friends that I've posed these questions to, though, the general consensus is from such a small and statistically relevant data set is that simply that we mostly like to share with other people in the same social class, right? Which is making around the same money, lives around, the same kind of lifestyle, right? Rather than other people of the same race, right? The complaint that I can see on this point is that, for instance, I'm Asian, right? Maybe some of you are looking at me and going like, well, all Asians are techies, so you guys are in the same class anyway. That, I think, rather silly point can be refuted very easily if you ever step into the city of San Francisco, for instance, right? I remember when I first went there and saw the first concentration of Asian hobos that I've seen in any American city. First time in San Francisco, okay? I mean, would anyone think that I have anything in common with those people? Yeah, no, okay? That's just not gonna happen, right? Point number 3, finally, in terms of how to utilize whatever current disadvantages that you have to focus upon future outcomes politically. This is where things get weird, okay? I just don't get why people think things like welfare is a race thing. I mean, it's a fact that white people get the majority of welfare in this country, okay? That's not surprising because there are simply more white people around than other people in the USA, right? Not bagging on white people or any other people, right? We could all be down on our luck at any given moment in time, right? I should know, okay? I don't have a real job right now, okay? So at any moment, I am perilously close to a hobo than any of you guys, okay? My point is, I really don't get that when we're talking about political discourse, I hardly ever hear about the struggles of the poor purely because they're poor, right? Instead, I hear about it like this. Oh, they're poor, but also minority. Oh, they're poor, but also part of the majority. Do these two types of poor really differ that much, right? Like in terms of what they want or need? I mean, because if you look at the opposite end, at rich folks, to me, rich folks all look, the same, right? In terms of our bougie interests anyway. So why would any poor person vote for politicians that wants to cut government entitlement programs? Isn't that like a cross-racial item? And again, I don't want to talk about this as if I'm strictly talking about the poor or the rich, right? Like, why does the culture war items dominate the media in the spectrum for middle-class families' attention, right? Who cares what a holiday is called, right? The examples that I'm thinking of is like, did New Jersey rename Columbus Day to Indigenous People Day or whatever? Like, how does a symbolic naming thing affect any middle-class person's actual life on a day-to-day basis, right? Do you not feel manipulated that cultural or racial differences that barely matter is what's being focused on instead of either or both major political parties, doing something to help you feed your family or save for retirement, or at least untangle the mess that is our current tax system or healthcare system instead? Now, for a country that has such a, pronounced and large and strong middle class, I'm surprised that this group as a whole is so easily misled and manipulated into being completely impotent in terms of getting real results from their public servants, right? Again, that to me has little to do with race and where someone's from or like immigrant status, but with class needs. No? At the end of the day, I'm sure glad that I am not a public policy person, because it's hard enough to take into account the requirement of any group of people, much less balance the needs of multiple groups, right? I personally truly believe that the USA is strong precisely because of its many different divergent groups here, right? And the differences in culture can create unexpected and awesome combinations, right? And drive a society forward. I do think that, though, class differences can be just as potent, if not more so, than cultural or racial differences, right? And I'm mostly curious as to why we Americans are silent in acknowledging this aspect of our social makeup, right? I mean, I think the subject is actually changing slowly with the rise of politicians such as Bernie Sanders and his unabashed democratic socialist bend. I'm not saying that I agree with his particular type of classist rhetorics, but at least I agree that talking about challenges in terms of class is as relevant as its parallel in racial terms, right? Man, I feel like I'm repeating myself, and it probably doesn't matter how many times I do so, and it will still be probably misunderstood, but I'll say it again. Not saying that racism isn't a current and persistent problem, but I do think some of the major issues facing people stuck in their situations might be better solved when looking at it from a classist point of view instead, right? I don't know, maybe I'm naive or optimistic, two things that I don't think anyone who's ever known me has ever accused me of, but don't we have more in common with our fellow man than not? Anyway, do what you like, comment, like, or whatever below. Cheers.